Hi, and welcome to my 7th tutorial on chess basics. Today we're going to look at how the king moves and captures. And after this tutorial we have covered all the chess pieces. Now the king is the most important piece on the board, because if it is trapped the game is lost. But the king is definitely not the strongest piece on the board. In the beginning of a game it is fair to say it is one of the weakest pieces. But as the game progresses and there are fewer pieces on the board, it becomes stronger. The king can only move one square at a time, but it can move horizontally, vertically, and diagonally, which means that the white king can move on these squares, and the black king can move to these squares in its next move. With only the kings on the board, it seems fairly simple, but there are a few rules that need to be followed. First of all, the king can never move to a square which allows it to be captured. That would put the king in what is called check, which we are going to cover in detail in our next tutorial. So right now, the white king could move to any of these squares, but it can't move to these two squares because they cover the squares the black king can move to. If it was black's king to move, it couldn't move to these two squares here because that covers the area that the white king could move to or dominate. So the kings can never be on adjacent squares. So we now know that the king can move to one of these squares. Now let's move the black king a little closer. If it is white to move, we can't move to e5 because of the black king. Let's also give black a knight on b7 here. And we know already how the knight moves. So this black knight covers these squares and also this square here on c5, and that means that the white king cannot move to c5, because if it did, it would move into a square which the black knight could capture on. We are going to put in a last piece here, a bishop on h7. And as we know, the bishop only moves on diagonals, and that covers these squares. And as you can see, two of those squares cover squares that our white king could have moved to. So it's not always that easy to move the king around the board. When it comes to capturing other pieces, there are a few things you have to consider. Now we know that pawns move in a straight line, and the black pawn could move to these three squares, but it captures diagonally, which means that if there are pieces here or here, it could capture. So for our white king to capture this black pawn, we cannot move here because we would be moving into a capturing square. To capture this pawn, we would have to move our king here or here and then capture it, like this. I've placed a few more pieces on the board to make it look more complicated, but actually it's not. Now we know that the knight is more powerful than the pawn, but we can't take the knight on d3 because right now it is protected by the pawn on c4. Nothing is protecting the pawn, so what we can do is we can actually go here to d4, and one possible move for black would be to move his knight to b2 and protect the pawn. And now we can move our king to c3 to chase the knight away, because if it doesn't move, we can take it. And when the knight moves, we can take the pawn. So for the king to capture an enemy piece, it has to move where it's not in the line of fire. The black knight can move to these two squares, which means that our king has to move here to capture the knight. The bishop covers these squares, so our white king cannot move to any of these squares. And to be able to capture the black bishop, our king will have to move here and then take the bishop. The white king can also sneak up on a rook, but when it comes to the opponent's queen, it's a different story. You just can't get to it. Right now, the black queen covers these squares, and as you can see, that includes all the neighboring squares. So the only way to capture the black queen is if it actually moves right next to your king. This tutorial ends the lessons concerning how the pieces move and capture. The king should have been the simplest to explain since it only moves one square at a time, but as long as we don't know too much about check and checkmate, we really don't get the whole picture. There are still some special moves and rules we need to cover, so in our next tutorials we will be looking at check and checkmate, castling, en passant, and stalemate. Until next time.